On a recent live broadcast where I was building a perch stool, I talked about the idea if you don't have a lathe, you can make octagonal legs. And kind of ran out of time during the live broadcast to actually show how to make octagonal legs. So today, I want to walk you through taking a square blank like this and turning it into not just an octagon, but a tapered octagon. So to start with, you will need a blank that is cut to the length of your leg or whatever the part would be, and you want it to be square on 4 faces. You also want the ends to be square. They don't really have to be that cleaned up, but they should be square. Because once you taper it on all 4 sides, you actually lose the vertical axis. And if you've got more work or joinery or tapering or something to do on that, you do want to maintain that axis. First things first, I need to figure out how much I want to taper it. This piece of poplar is 1 3/4 inches thick. So I think what I'll do is taper it down to 1 inch. So what I need to do, 1 3/4, I've got to remove 3/4 of an inch. So if I divide 3/4 by 2, that's 3/8 of an inch. So I need to set my combo square to 3/8 of an inch and mark lines on all 4 faces to create a 1 inch square that's set in 3/8 of an inch from the outside of the existing blank. While I'm down here, I'm just going to go ahead and make little tick marks where these lines intersect the edges so that it's a little bit more visible on the face of the boards. Now with those little tick marks laid out, I can bring a straight edge in, line it up there on that tick mark, and then line it up on the top edge here, so I'm essentially flush. Connect those points. I've got my taper laid in on the side. I'll do the same thing on the opposite edge. Now I can see the taper and it comes down, and if you want to verify, again, you can check and see I've got a 1 inch dimension down here and my full 1 1/3. Now you want to repeat that on all 4 faces. So I've already done that. You should see the taper laid out on all the faces. And if you want, you can come in and mark the waist just so you don't get confused on things. It's not a bad idea. And there's really nothing more complex than we just have to plane down to the lines. So I'm going to use my 4-plane because it's got a mixture of able to hog off a lot of material and a nice long sole for taking things down evenly. Let's just start on this face and work our way down. Could probably take a little heavier cut. The key is to just keep looking at your lines. And just working right down to them. Now I'm super close here, so I think I'll switch to a joiner plane. The key is, if I look back here, I can see a little bit of area that I haven't planed because my lines intersect this edge. So ideally, I won't be removing any material right back at the edge. So I can set the plane right on the edge of the board, but you'll see the taper begins very quickly. So one of the things the joiner plane is really good at is because it's got this nice long sole in front of the blade, I can set that down and actually tip it forward and reference it onto the taper. And that will actually prevent the blade from cutting because it's tilted it down and lifted the blade out of the cut until it intersects. And what will happen with every pass you take, you're drawing this unplaned line back just a little bit further till you bring the whole thing into the same geometric plane. That felt pretty good. Maybe one more pass and I ought to nail my line. All right, one more pass because I skipped in the middle, but you'll notice it's probably a little hard to see, but there's a tiny, the unplaned section is just a hair darker where the wood is oxidized. And there's just this tiny little hair of oxidized wood, like right there. And technically, if you remember, I want to plane until that disappears. There we go. The blade engaged right on the edge, and my pencil line is now gone. I need to bring my lines back onto this face so I can see. I'll rotate it 90 degrees and plane down to those lines. Well, I need the lines that I just removed to do that. So I have to add that back in, just like I did before, and repeat the entire process on all 4 faces. Except now I'm working against the grain here, so I need to lighten up my cut a little. Once I establish a taper here, I'll actually be working downhill, and it will lessen the tear out. There we go. Now it's planing easier because the geometry is downhill and it's angling closer to parallel to the grain. It just makes things a heck of a lot easier. Finally, when you come to the last face, you've got this nice skinny face, and it actually goes even faster. The beauty of tapering the entire thing is now the whole leg kind of sits at that angle, and you're already planing right downhill. Don't forget to keep checking square. You do want to keep these faces square to one another. Once you've got all 4, you should end up with a nice, perfectly tapered leg. And if I check my layout marks down at the bottom, I should have met that square that I laid in. Now, obviously, I rushed through this. I've got a more detailed, actually a live recording of a live broadcast where I talked about how to do this process, how to get to this part of the build. It's from here that we deviate, and we need to turn our tapered square into a tapered octagon. To lay out the octagon, we need to go back to the end, and I'm just going to connect corner to corner to give myself a rough center. Then I need a compass. Put that in the center, and I need to set it to the radius of the circle. And then I will draw that circle. And now where the circle intersects those crosshairs, take my combo square and the 45-degree fence. I'll drop the pencil on that intersection. Strike a line across there. And I'll do this on all 4 corners. And what I've just created is that octagon. These are now the faces, and I do the same thing where I'll just make the little tick marks on the edges. And you guessed it, now I need to come back with a straight edge and connect the tick marks down here, but now I've got tick marks on the top because I've already laid out the octagon on the top. And so I connect these lines to essentially lay out the extents of the octagonal face. And you guessed it, repeat that on all the faces. So now I have to do the same thing again, but I'm working on the corners now. A while ago, I did a podcast called The Joiner Saddles, and I just made really a series of blocks with V-cuts in them. Which, by the way, if you haven't seen that, it'll be useful for this episode, but there's also a great tip in there on using the reflection of your saw to get nice square cuts. This becomes even faster work because we're really removing very little stock right now. And it's nice because I've got a very clear picture of my layout lines. But I'm removing more material on this end than on the bottom end. It's just the opposite of what I was doing before. So don't get carried away and just really pay attention to your layout lines. You're balancing the plane a little, so it can be a little tippy. So just pay attention to the face you're creating and your pencil lines. In other words, there's no fancy technique here other than observation. Okay, I am just barely touching those lines. So now I'll come in with the joiner plane. I want to work until those lines disappear. And ideally, the foreplane is our sculpture tool. So at this point, we've created an edge that is square and is kind of evenly dropping, but you want to pay attention when your pencil lines start to disappear. You don't want a plane there anymore. So I've got a little pencil line right here, and the pencil line disappears from the end down. So I just want to take a quick pass right there. Another one, the pencil line has disappeared. So I'm going to come back and take one pass the full length. And there's my first iris. Yup, you guessed it. Rinse and repeat. One tapered octagonal leg. That's all there is to it. Honestly, the most difficult part of this is all the layout. So if you find yourself making a lot of these, I mean, first and foremost, if you're making a chair, you're probably going to need at least 3, probably 4 of these legs. So what I actually do is I create a story stick. This is the story stick that I use to make a pencil post bed, which is just tapered octagons. I laid out the larger octagon and the smaller octagon, and this outer square actually represents my original blank, the original square blank we started with. So it's very easy to come in, line everything up flush, draw in that octagon, draw on the octagon on the top, and the lines on the story stick correspond to the lines on the face, and you can just plane down to that. Honestly, having the lines on the side, kind of a nice guide, but once you've done a few of them, you find that you don't really need that anymore, and you can work just to your lines on the end grain. It all comes down to taking those complete passes. And the key is we've tapered it on all 4 sides, so the end is still square to the long axis. Both ends are still square to the long axis. So if you've got to do any kind of tapering or anything like that, you still have this as a reference surface. That's all she wrote, folks.